My name is Michael Erlewine, and welcome to Spirit Grooves. This show is one of a three-part series on mixing the mind, which is merging your meditation practice off the cushion with your daily workflow. This is the story of how I managed to get a tiny glimpse of the recognition of the true nature of the mind. I write it not to boast or show off, but because having had this initial recognition, I immediately see how simple it is and how all of those years I had managed to look every which way but loose in trying to see it. My wish is that something that I write here may make it easier for others to have this same recognition. And any teeny tiny part of what I write here that is useful, I dedicate to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, that they may further assist all sentient beings to become enlightened sooner than later. Growing up in Ann Arbor, home to the University of Michigan, meant that I was exposed to a cosmopolitan atmosphere from an early age. Even in the late 50s, I was already reading a smattering of Buddhist literature, although my take back then on the Dharma was that it was intellectual, something that, like existentialism, we would stay up late at night talking about while drinking coffee and smoking a lot of cigarettes. In the 1960s, I toyed with some more advanced Dharma concepts and certainly played a bit at meditation. But it was not until the 1970s that I actually did any real practice. February of 1974 to be exact, because that was the date that I met Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche when he came to speak in Ann Arbor. I had read some of his books with great interest and was eager to see him in person. As it turned out, since few people knew of him back then, I ended up as his chauffeur for the weekend and as the designer of the poster for his public talk. After meeting Trungpa at the airport, one of the first things that Trungpa did after getting into Ann Arbor was to beckon me into a small office room and spend an hour or so personally teaching me to meditate, although he never mentioned the word and I had no idea what he was showing me. I was just very glad to be with him. It was Trungpa who first pointed out to me, and to everyone I knew, that the Buddha always intended the Dharma as a method or life path, and not as something to just think about. In 1974, that was real news to me, and from that year onward, I tried to intensify my study of the Dharma and learn to practice it. I was not all that successful at practice, but I continued to be attracted to the great tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. It was not until 1983 that I found my personal, or what's called my root teacher. That was the year that I met Venerable Khenpo Kata Rinpoche of Karma Triana Dharmachakra Monastery, KTD, near Woodstock, New York, actually in the mountains above it. That's when I really became serious about Dharma practice. Khenpo Rinpoche was the teacher I had always dreamed about meeting, and have been working with him ever since. It's been about 30 years now. Of all the Buddhist teachings that I've attended over these last 30 years, the yearly 10-day summer Mahamudra intensive with Khenpo Kata Rinpoche at KTD Monastery has been the most striking and influential. The first 10-day Mahamudra teaching was in 1989, and this yearly event, I've not missed one yet, is now going into its, 24th year. In addition, sandwiched somewhere during that time were 2 years of intensive Mahamudra teachings and practice with His Eminence Tai Situ Rinpoche, who's one of the 4 regents of the Karma Kagyu lineage. This video is not an introduction to Mahamudra meditation, which I'm not qualified to offer, but is simply a recounting of my own encounter with this profound technique and its effects on me personally. Mahamudra meditation is considered the main form of meditation and practice among the Karma Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. As mentioned, I am not qualified to teach or even introduce readers to the more advanced techniques of Mahamudra meditation. So here it will have to be enough to simply say that to learn Mahamudra meditation, one has to first study it academically and then work with a qualified teacher who can actually point out to you, help you recognize the true nature of the mind, after which, if you grasp the pointing out instructions, you must diligently practice the Mahamudra techniques. This much information is readily available all over the internet. For myself, I've had a great deal of teachings on Mahamudra and have been well exposed to it academically, which simply means I understand conceptually the basic concepts. Academic or conceptual understanding of Mahamudra by itself can never qualify as recognition, much less enlightenment or realization, which by definition is beyond the reasoning mind. In a similar vein, the many experiences that I've had that might be related to Mahamudra, bits of illumination for a day or part of a day, also are not what Mahamudra is about either. While many or most Tibetan Buddhist practices are designed for gradual progress toward illumination, like a smooth incline, Mahamudra practice has at least one very clear speed bump right at the beginning, and that is recognizing the true nature of the mind. You either have or you have not had that recognition. There's nothing like, well, maybe I've had it and maybe I haven't. If you have it, you know it. Because it is a threshold event, recognizing the nature of the mind has become a huge topic of speculation among those students who read about and are learning to practice Mahamudra, replete with wild expectations and preconceptions based on the imaginations of those who have never had the experience. Recognition of the mind is one of those experiences, as they say, that if you have any doubt whatsoever about your recognition, then you simply have not had it. This is a real arrogance stopper for most of us. If we are being honest, we know we have not had that experience, no matter how much we wish we had. In the Zen tradition, this recognition is called kensho, and they make just as much fuss about it as the Tibetans. And most important, our expectations and hopes about what that experience is like are perhaps the greatest barrier to actually having the experience itself. You can't just recognize the true nature of the mind many times, but only once. If you have to do it repeatedly, then you are just having experiences of the mind, but have not yet recognized anything. This is because recognition is not some kind of temporary experience, like a spiritual high or a lofty state of mind, like many imagine. And above all, recognition is not enlightenment. Instead, it's simply finally recognizing or seeing how the mind actually works for the first time, just as we might recognize an old friend in a crowd, Or most of all, for me, it's like one of those figure ground paintings where suddenly you see the embedded image in it. It is literally recognition and not a transport to some blissful state of enlightenment. Enlightenment and our path toward it is what we begin to work toward after recognition of the mind's true nature. Of course, there's no way for me to communicate this properly with words, and I apologize. However, I wish I had understood this distinction early on. It would have been a huge help. As mentioned, recognition is like gazing at those figure ground paintings. You can't fake it. You can give up looking, but either you see the embedded image within the picture or you don't. You can memorize what you are told you should see, but finally, being honest, you either recognize the mind's true nature or you don't. And recognition is just the beginning of real practice, not the end. It's not any kind of final result or stage, and that point is key. Recognition is your ante-in. It's only the doorway to Mahamudra practice. You literally cannot do Mahamudra meditation without that initial recognition. So it's like the ring pasnad, or guardian on the threshold that the Western occultists often write about. Practitioners like myself can study and undertake most Dharma practices and work up a pretty good semblance of a successful practice. We can certainly talk ourselves into believing we're going somewhere, and perhaps others are even impressed. But this is why they call it practice, and term the practices that we do preliminaries, because they are just that. They're prelims, qualifying exams, and they're a getting ready for the actual work, which is yet to begin. Now for a little bit of my story. My teacher, Khenpo Kata Rinpoche, had given what are called the pointing out instructions once before at these yearly 10-day Mahamudra teachings. But try as I might, I had failed to grasp what it was that actually was being pointed out. And so my experience remained largely conceptual. I was not able to actually practice Mahamudra because I had not yet had a glimpse of the true nature of my mind, which, as mentioned, is a prerequisite by definition for Mahamudra practice. Then, at the 10-day Mahamudra teachings at KTD Monastery in 2005, while studying a text by Karma Chagme Rinpoche called The Union of Mahamudra in Dzogchen, Khenpo Kata Rinpoche again gave the pith instructions, what are called the pointing out instructions, the instructions by and through which a receptive student may be able to recognize the true nature of the mind. These instructions were part of the actual text by Karma Chagme, which my teacher was presenting and commenting on. Of course, I'd heard all the words before. I'd been repeatedly exposed to what is called by some the analytical tradition, or the middle way school, which is often introduced by asking the student to actually look at his or her own mind and answer simple questions like, is the mind the color red? Or is the mind the color blue? This kind of talk had always been a super yawn for me, for it was just obvious to me that the mind was not red or blue. What was this all about? I could never understand why something as profound as Buddhism could resort to such simple questions. So I'd heard this kind of presentation for years, and in many different formats, and I had always told myself privately that this particular kind of teaching was probably not for me. Either I didn't get it at all, or it was just too easy. I couldn't tell which, but I knew that the mind was not the color blue. Perhaps some academic pundit delighted in answering such questions, but it was the best I could do to politely ignore the temptation to be condescending of this approach. Is the mind red? Of course it's not red. The mind is not red. I not so patiently waited until this section was over, and we could hopefully get to some of the good stuff, something that would actually grab me. But there was one thing. I was intrigued to learn that in Tibet, when this approach was presented, monks would be given a question such as, "Is the mind red?" and then asked to go off and think about it for 3 entire days and nights, then come back and give their answers, after which they would be given a similar question, but perhaps with the color green. And this would go on for something like 3 months. Hearing this troubled me. For monks, not to mention Rinpoches, they're not foolish people. What on earth was this all about, I wondered, this asking, what color is the mind? And this is no secret teaching. This same middle way approach has been taught all over India for centuries. Anyway, I stopped trying to wait this section out and began to pay more attention to what Rinpoche was presenting. It took a while, but my takeaway from all of this questioning stuff was that Rinpoche was asking us to actually stop thinking academically about this and simply go and look at our mind and see for ourselves if it was red or green or whatever the question was. And that very slowly began to sink in. I certainly meant no disrespect, but I had never before followed Rinpoche's simple request to look at the mind, to see if it was red or blue, because I felt that the question made no sense to me. Yet I was starting to pick up on the fact that Rinpoche was asking us to get off our mental duffs and actually make an effort to look at our own mind right there on the spot. I had, of course, always assumed I already knew my own mind. After all, I was a Dharma practitioner, and it was my mind. But now I was hearing something just a little different. Perhaps my habitual familiarity with my mind had not included actually looking at it. Although I automatically assumed I had already and always done that long ago. Back when I first learned to meditate. And so very slowly at first, and not without some struggle, I actually began to make efforts to stop looking outward at what was going on around me and turned and tried to look inward at the mind itself. And this was not easy. Of course, by then I was already familiar with the little chatterbox inside my head. Whoever it is that plans out my day for me, saying things to me like, "It's almost time for lunch," or "You have a dentist appointment tomorrow," and so on. Whoever that inner person is, it's not really me. And I probably don't like him all that much. It's annoying and way too much of a nag. And it yammers on endlessly. So I began to at least differentiate myself from that, what I called my uptight narrator in my head. That talking voice that was no friend of mine, just not my kind of people. And Rinpoche was asking that we look at whoever it is inside of us that is looking at all the stuff happening outside in the world. And I guess that would have to be me. Now this was a whole lot more difficult than just putting some distance between me and my internal narrator. When I tried to look at who in there was doing the looking at the outside world, it or I, whatever we would call it, just would not hold still. It was like those magnets that repel one another. Every time I would try to look at who was looking, to look at the looker, the whole thing would just flip around. It was very tiring to even try. You can try it now for yourselves. Just look at who is listening to this talk. Try and find the who. What was happening through all of this, what was actually happening was that I was very gradually just beginning to exercise the mind, to exercise the muscles of the mind that, I guess to my knowledge, had never been exercised before in my life. And they were soon the equivalent of some very sore or very stiff muscles, because it was hard to move the mind around. I had never done this kind of thing before, and it amounted to giving myself a mental Charlie horse. It cramped up my mind, and it was very awkward, but it was a new experience. The whole thing was a little like trying to erect a large circus tent in the middle of my mind. I hope you have enjoyed this segment of Spirit Grooves. If you'd like to read further on awareness, please see my free ebooks on astrologyland.com. Look for the book link in the middle of the page. My name is Michael Erlewine, and I curate what is probably the largest library of astrology in the world, the Heart Center Library. I hope you have enjoyed this segment of Spirit Grooves, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.